Okay. Good morning, everyone. Okay. So let's introduce very shortly what's the aim of the study we have done since more or less now 15 years. We want to measure in a rather technical way, I will not be too technical today, religious behavior, religious attitudes of persons. And the first remark, and I think it's a very important remark, I see belief or faith, I'm mixing a little bit the two concepts on the moment, as a product of the interaction between elements present in the culture and the person. So in fact, everyone, more or less, is confronted with elements of a specific religious tradition. That can be, in the Catholic tradition, a Bible story, that can be a ritual, that can be some pronunciation of the Pope, that can be a symbol or something like that. And people are interacting with that. They are doing something in their mind, you can say. In fact, this is a cognitive but also an affective process. So that is what we try to study. You can say how people are reading or interacting with elements of a specific religious environment. And in the first moment, I will try to give a very short overview of what we call religious attitude studies. How we can measure religiosity within the people. And the first approach, and still used at the moment, is that people are asking very simple, what we call single items, very simple questions. For example, are you a believer? Or are you religious? And then you can answer yes or no, or very high or very low, something like that. That's not important at the moment. Or do you belong to a specific church or a specific religious denomination, etc., etc. But in fact, it's a very ambivalent and ambiguous question. Because if people answer yes, I'm a believer, of course, you don't know what they believe. They can believe in superstition, they can believe in God, they can believe in everything. So in fact, it's a very ambivalent, ambiguous answer you have if you ask a very general single item question. A more precise approach of religious attitude, and that is the famous model of Glock and Stark, two sociologists introducing a model. They are considering that, and now I focus on, you can say, Christian religious attitude. They focus on five fundamental, for them, Glock and Stark, five fundamental dimensions. The first dimension is the dimension of knowledge. You have to know something about your religious tradition. Knowing on the moment has nothing to do with belief or religious conviction. It's only knowing. You have to know, for example, that you have four Gospels, not five, not six, not seven, but only four. In Catholic tradition, we speak of 7 sacraments, etc., etc. So the first element is an element of knowing. The second element, and perhaps more important, is an element of conviction. People believe something, are approving religious statements. People believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, or people believe in the existence of God, or something like that. Second dimension, conviction dimension. Third dimension is the dimension of ethics. So the Glock and Stark are considering that if people are believing, there are some specific consequences. They have some specific ethical impacts, you can say. Fourth dimension is dimension of experience. Namely, people can attribute some religious meanings to events in their concrete life. So for Glock and Stark, religious experience is nothing special. It's nothing extraordinary. It's in fact a more or less daily event. So something is happening and you're giving a kind of religious meaning to that element. And the fifth dimension is the dimension of ritual. So in specific Christian tradition, people are participating in rituals. Rituals can be the baptism, rituals can be the Eucharist on Sunday, something like that. Now, so in fact, Glock and Stark are asking 5 types of questions. Knowledge questions, convictional questions, ritual questions, ethical questions, and religious experience questions. And then, of course, people can have a high score, so giving many positive answers, or low score, not giving many specific answers to that questions. So at the end of that process, you have an index, you can say, a sum of positive answers is an index of your belief system. But in fact now, with that model of Glock and Stark still used on the moment in many, most of the time, sociological studies, we can ask some questions. The first question is, and that's perhaps more a question for theologians than for psychologists. I'm not a theologian, I'm a simple psychologist. Is belief or faith, can that be considered as a sum of this kind of statements, approving different statements? The second question you can ask is the fact, and that's a very important question, I will come back on that later on, how people understand the different statements. For example, if you believe in the real presence in the Eucharist, how do you understand that? Do you understand that in a rather literal way, like children are doing that many times, or do you understand it as a metaphorical, symbolic way? And that will be, later on, perhaps the most important distinction. For example, you have the story in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is walking on the water. That's in fact a Bible story. Now the question is fundamentally if he really walks on the water, or if that is a story with a different underlying meaning. And a third element, or a third question you can ask, and that's perhaps one of the most important questions in sociology and psychology of religion, that there is a tendency, not 40 years ago, but until now, that people with a high level of religiosity, so that means people giving many positive answers, there is a tendency that these people are ethnocentric. That means that these people have negative feelings against other cultures, other religions, and other traditions. And that's, of course, a paradox. A paradox in the sense that the Christian tradition is preaching tolerance and openness, friendship, you can say, and there is a tendency that these people with a high index of religiosity are people who have a tendency to be ethnocentric. Be very careful now. I say a tendency to be ethnocentric. That doesn't mean that all believers are ethnocentric. But technically we see there is a kind of collaboration, a kind of collusion between the two, ethnocentricity, so negative feelings to other religions, other traditions, and this kind of index of religiosity. So two steps. The single item step, very simple questions, single questions, and then the model of Glockenstock. Now I had to introduce very shortly perhaps one of the most important psychologists of religion of the last decades, namely Allport, Gordon Allport. Allport was puzzled by that relation between religiosity, the index of Glockenstock and also other indices, and ethnocentricity, and wants to give an answer to that problem, wants to give a solution to that problem. Important now for Allport, and he was himself a very pious and religious man, and that's rather exceptional for psychologists, Allport is introduced. Sorry. It's perhaps, it happens more that these people are pious and religious when they are theologians, but for psychologists it seems to be a problem. Now, Allport is introducing, in fact, his personality model. So he starts with his personality model, and he's trying to introduce that personality model into the field of religion. What is very shortly Allport's personality model? Very reduced, very shortly. Allport said everyone has to make an evolution in his personal life from what he calls an extrinsic motivation to later on an intrinsic motivation. What's now extrinsic? Extrinsic, for example, Allport says, the baby is loving his mother because the mother is giving food, is supporting him, etc., etc. So let's say the target of loving his mother is extrinsic, in the sense that the baby receives something from the mother. This has to evolve during life, during personal development, into what he calls an intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic means then the person, adolescent, adult, is loving his mother because she is his mother. Not because she's giving something, but because of the person of the mother. Now, Allport is introducing that model into the psychology of religion or into religion. Allport says people can be religious on an extrinsic way or an intrinsic way. Extrinsic way means that in fact the person is religious because of non-religious elements. For example, to make it a little bit clear, people are going to Mass on Sunday because they see other people. People are participating in so-called religious groups because so they have contact with other people. It's a kind of social environment. Or people are perhaps religious because religion gives a kind of social status. So in fact, the aim, the target to be religious is not because of religion, but because of other social supporting things, for example. Normally, Albert said, people has to evolve not only from an intrinsic, but to from an extrinsic, but to an intrinsic motivation. What's now an intrinsic motivation? That means that people are religious because of the religion itself, because of the religious value. So Alpert distinguishing two kinds of religiosity, two motivational structures, you can say. An extrinsic motivational structure to an intrinsic motivational structure. And Alpert has tried to give a solution to the problem of ethnocentricity, because he sees, in many research, not only Alpert, but later on after him, hundreds of studies, that extrinsic people have a tendency to be ethnocentric. Intrinsic people are not ethnocentric. Remarkable for Alpert is now, and he has no solution for that problem, he sees that some people, and he calls them religious muddleheads, that some people are giving positive answers to extrinsic and intrinsic. And in fact, for Alpert, that was not possible, because he was considering that a person was or extrinsic or intrinsic. And now he sees that some people are and extrinsic and intrinsic at the same time. And these people giving positive answers to each kind of question, the intrinsic and the extrinsic kind, are in fact highly ethnocentric. So that's a real problem. People give an answer to every religious question have a tendency to be ethnocentric. Okay. That's the first moment in introduction. So we tried also in the Flanders, that's a very small country comparing with your country, we tried out and the model of Alpert and also other models, and that we have seen now with the Alpert model, that in fact in the Flanders, most of the people are religious muddleheads, so are scoring high on both of the dimensions. That means very clearly, in fact, are not making a distinction between the extrinsic and the intrinsic motivation. That's the first problem. So the correlations between the two dimensions were very, very high. People don't distinguish between the two. That's the first problem. The second problem is, and that's until now a little bit the case, also in the Glock and Stark model, that in fact there is no place for unbelief. What's an unbeliever in Alpert's model? An unbeliever is someone who is scoring low on extrinsic and on intrinsic. So there is no specificity for unbelief. That's just the same thing with the model of Glock and Stark. The unbeliever in the model of Glock and Stark, you know, with the 5 dimensions, are people giving perhaps 1 or 2 positive answers and all the rest negative answers. So it means there is a problem that unbelief is more or less low belief or not a presence of belief. And that's a very important, I think, psychological question. How do we articulate the relation between belief and unbelief? Is unbelief low belief, or is unbelief something different than belief? So I think, and I cannot go further on the moment on that problem, that we have, you can say, a kind of specific psychology for belief, but perhaps a different, but also specific psychology of unbelief. So we had to make a distinction between the psychology of the believers and the psychology of the unbelievers. In most of the cases, certainly in very secularized countries, people are considering that the normal starting situation of every person, so the so-called neutral situation, is equal to unbelief. And then you have some very strange people who are constructing a kind of structure of belief. That means that we had to explain why some people are believing, and that you had not to explain why some people are unbelieving, because unbelieving is considered as equal as the neutral beginning situation. And that's very important. So I think we had to do studies, more specific studies, about the problem of belief and also the problem of unbelief. So we have seen, in more or less 92, that the model of Alpert doesn't work, in the Flanders. So we start again, and then we have found, on the moment, its first publication, 91, the book of David Wolf. David Wolf is an American psychologist writing a book, Psychology of Religion, what gives an overview of different fields, different approaches in the psychology of religion. And at the end of his book, in the epilogue, he tries to make a kind of synthesis, to see how people are approaching religion. David Wolf says that's a heuristic scheme. It's not an empirical scheme on that moment in 91. So it's a scheme, try to integrate different approaches from psychologists, and he says also for normal people, to how people interact with religion. And David Wolf is starting from 2 basic axes, and that's important. You can give the slide, please. Okay? Oh yeah, fine. its format is extraordinary. Who? So, David Wolf is starting from the following model. It's a theoretical model. It's a heuristic model. It's not an empirical model on that moment. He says every time a person is interacting with an element of that religious tradition, I repeat, it can be a Bible story, it can be a ritual, it can be a statement of the Pope, it can be a symbol, it can be the confrontation with the church, for example. Every time again, underlying, people are approaching this element in function of belief and unbelief. That means you have a kind of believing approach, or in the opposite, a kind of unbelieving approach. Secondly, every time, and that's now important, people are approaching that element, the story, the ritual, from what he calls a literal interpretation to a symbolic interpretation. I will explain a little bit what I mean by literal and symbolic. And I repeat the story of Mark, namely the story of Jesus walking on the water. If you have a kind of literal approach, that means that the story is a real, concrete story. Jesus really walked on the water. There is only one meaning, namely the story is a kind of document trying to say that Jesus did that specific event. And if you have problems to understand that Jesus can walk on the water, that's a question of belief. You have to believe it. If you don't understand, believe it. That's a little bit what I call literal. That means, and that's now very fundamental, that the story has only one meaning. That the meaning will be the same 2,000 years ago and within 2,000 years. It will always be the same meaning. No interpretation, no underlying. That's in opposition with what we call symbolic meaning. Symbolic means that in fact, if you are confronted with that kind of story, the story needs a kind of interpretation. That means, in that concrete story, you have two layers of interpretation, or two layers you can say. At first you have the concrete story. Jesus walked on the water. And the second is, what's the meaning of that story? So you have to try to grasp the meaning of that story. Fundamental now is that grasping the meaning of that story can change through your own personal development. So that means that the meaning can be different when you're a child, and can be different when you're an adolescent, and can be different when you're an adult. So there is a kind of evolution in the underlying meaning. Secondly, it can be that different persons can give different interpretations. So there is a kind of multiple relation between the story and the interpretation. To give an example, I don't know in Australia, but I think so. Here in Belgium, at December 6th, children are receiving little presents from St. Nicholas. You know St. Nicholas? More or less. Okay. In fact, as an adult, we know, of course, that St. Nicholas is equal to our parents. It's our parents who are giving the presents. But children until the age of 6, 7, 8 more or less are believing that St. Nicholas is giving the presents. Later on, so we know, as an adult, as an adolescent, we know that not St. Nicholas is giving the present, but the parents. But in fact, we can still use the story. The story means more or less that there is a kind of relation between parents and children, between parents and adolescents. That's what I mean by symbolic. Okay. Now, Wolf is saying, if we have the two basic axes, belief, unbelief, literal and symbolic, there are 4 different approaches to elements of the religious tradition. At first, what he calls literal affirmation. Literal affirmation are believers. Believe, but at the same time are literal thinkers. That's the first element. I will come back on that later on. Then you have literal disaffirmation. That are literal thinkers, but are unbelievers. You can say in a certain sense, what's a literal disaffirmation? That's a person who is saying, it's impossible to walk on the water, so I don't believe. I believe only in things who can be approved scientifically. It's a kind of positive scientific approach. I believe only in things you can show me that you believe. Then you have reductive interpretation. For David Wolf, the most important example of reductive interpretation is in fact Sigmund Freud. Very shortly, Sigmund Freud, being a Jewish person living in Vienna, knowing the Catholic and Jewish religious tradition, he's trying to say something why God is a father. Why do we call God a father? That's an element of the religious tradition. God is called a father. He is called a father by Jesus, etc., etc. Now Freud is trying to understand the meaning of that God-Father image. And he says, very shortly, God-Father is in fact nothing more than a remembrance of your unaggrandized father. So God-Father is in fact replacing your own father. In that sense, reductive interpretation. It's an interpretation, but it's reductive. It's reducing the name of God Father to a remembrance, to an idea of your own aggrandized father. And then you have restorative interpretation. Restorative interpretation is very important to note. Restorative interpretation has nothing to do with going back to the past, going back to restoration. No, restorative means, in that sense the scales are called post-critical belief, that in fact you are aware, a person is aware of the fact that he has to interpret. He is aware of the fact that you have some criticisms against this kind of stories, that people are doubting about this kind of stories, but in fact they can restore, rebuild, you can say, an interpretation. An interpretation valid on that moment, and perhaps an interpretation that can be changed later on. So that's the first scheme. When we start our research, the scheme of David Wolf. On that moment, I said there was no empirical research. And in fact, David Wolf is saying in his book that for him it seems very difficult to make an operationalization of that element of the four quadrants, you can say, the four approaches to religion. A little note between brackets, this model is what we call in psychology a typology. That means it's an abstract scheme. Concretely, that means that we will never find, some exceptions, never find persons who are only, for example, literal affirmation or only reductive interpretation. Everyone will have an element of the four quadrants in his thinking, but with the dominance of one of the four. So the four dimensions, more or less, are present in every person, but everyone, more or less, has a dominant in one of the four quadrants. So in Leuven now, we started, 92, 93, trying to study on an empirical way the model of David Wolf. And we have renamed a little bit the elements, a little bit more down, okay? Yeah, we have renamed a little bit. And here I have some problems with my College of Theology, but that's more their problem than my problem.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So we called belief and unbelief, literal and symbolic. The first field I called orthodoxy. Orthodoxy has thus nothing to do with a specific religious tradition. Orthodoxy is only a name, in fact a psychological concept, also used by other authors, try to give a name to people who are, let's say, believing on a literal way. Later on I will give some details of the different fields. Second, I called external critique. That was, in Wolf's model, literal disaffirmation. Why external? Because the critiques on religion are coming not from the person himself on the first level, but from the external world. For example, from positive science. For example, from Freud and other persons. So it's important to know the critique is coming from the external way. But we see very clearly, and empirical research has shown us very clearly, that in fact there is a similarity between orthodoxy and external critique. Both are literal thinkers. Orthodox are believing people, external critique are unbelieving people. I take now relativism. Relativism is an unbeliever, but a symbolic thinking. What's now relativism? Relativism, in fact, are people who are interested in religion, and I have to say a little bit more clear, in religions. So most of these people know many things about religion, are interested in religion, but are not committing themselves. It's not their cup of tea. So they know about religion, they are studying religion, they know something about Hinduism, they know something about Taoism, about Christianity, Protestantism, and this kind of things. They are very interested. They know that every time again there is a need of interpretation. They are aware that the different religious traditions are interpreting differently, but they are not committing themselves. It's not their cup of tea. And that are marked now, I think, and that we are doing some studies further on, there is a difference, I think. when a score is high on relativism for younger people and a score is high for older people, adults. I think for younger people it can be a transitional period. So it's a period of waiting. I'm seeing more or less around me, I'm trying to understand, but on the moment I don't take a commitment. You can say it's a process of exploring, and there you can compare it a little bit with identity formation. Identity formation means, certainly in adolescence, people are trying to give an answer on the question, who I am. And that, in the first moment, that process of exploring is exploring different fields. For example, adolescents are trying to explore which kind of study I will do later on, or which kind of career I will have, or which kind of relationship, or which kind of ideology, which kind of life philosophy. So they're exploring, but they're waiting. They wait until they can take a decision. And I think, I have the impression that for many adolescents, certainly in the Flanders, there is a kind of exploration process going on, and on that moment they are waiting. They're not committing themselves. Later on, it will be perhaps a little bit different. And then you have what I called second naivete. Second naivete is perhaps for you a rather strange concept. It's a concept I borrowed from the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Second naivete means that you can use the stories knowing that they are critics, that you have questions about that, etc., etc. But the stories have a meaning for me. I interpret the stories. I give a kind of underlying meaning. And in that underlying meaning, I recognize elements of my own existence, of my own life story, of my own experience. So I can use, you can say, as an horizon of meaning, the religious environment, and that gives an influence in my personal life. Okay. I come back a little bit, because we have done several studies about that, concerning the relation of religiosity, religion, faith you can say, and ethnocentricity. What we have seen now very clearly. At first, most ethnocentric, that means most, the correlation is rather high, is with orthodoxy. So orthodox people, literal believers, have a tendency to be ethnocentric. For technical purposes within you can say correlation is about 35, 30 until 40. So it's not terribly high, but it's in fact significant. So people have problems, Orthodox believers have problems with other religions, other cultures. Because of course they are aware, or they think, that their religious tradition is the only valid, the only good one. And that means that you have negative feelings against others. But also external critique people, so literal unbelievers, have a tendency to be ethnocentric. That means, and remember September 11, that religion, I think, is not the cause of ethnocentricity. It's the way you are interacting with religion. If you are interacting on a literal way, there is a tendency to be ethnocentric. But also, if you think literal, as an unbeliever, there is a tendency to be ethnocentric. Now, the relation from believers, orthodox and ethnocentricity, is higher than the relation external critique people and ethnocentricity. And I think that there are some reasons for that. The first, perhaps most important reason is that you have a group. When you are a believer, in the Catholic or Christian tradition, you belong to a group, and we call it a church. So you are a member of a group. You are borrowing, you can say, your identity from that specific community, from that specific group. That's not the case in Belgium, in the Flanders, with the unbelievers. Unbelievers are not organized in groups. So I think if you are organized in groups, then in fact it's a kind of reinforcement of that tendency to ethnocentricity. We see very clearly that relativism is negatively correlated with ethnocentricity. And I think the reason is very clear, like I explained 5 minutes ago. These people are not committing themselves. They are interested in religions, in different religions. And so they can integrate, they try to integrate, they see differences and similarities within different religious cultures, different religious traditions, and in fact they don't have negative feelings against that. And important, second naivete, and that's a little bit more it's not technical, but I will explain, there the correlation is 0. So there is no correlation between second naivete and ethnocentricity. Ladies and gentlemen, be careful now. No correlation doesn't mean negative. That means every time, also for people with the second naivete tradition, second naivete glasses, you can say, on religious reality, there is a possibility, a little danger, you can say, to be ethnocentric. So people have to be aware that every time they had to fight, you can say, against that possibility of negative feelings to other cultures. Okay. Now, if we are studying now the affective structure of that model, we see some interesting things. I will say 2 or 3 words about that. So we have tried to compare the affective structure and the different elements. Then we see very clearly that Orthodox people are happy with their way of believing. So they are associating positive feelings to orthodoxy, to their way of believing. But at the same time, also negative feelings. Feelings of frustration, feelings of guilt, and a little bit anxiety. So there is a kind of ambivalent affective structure when you are a literal believer. External critique people is more or less the same. There are no positive feelings, only negative feelings. Feelings of frustration, feelings of anxiety, feelings of anger. That means that in fact some people are unbelievers, literal unbelievers. For example, because at a certain moment in their life they have asking something to God. They have prayed, but in their experience God doesn't give an answer. So they are frustrating. They are asking something with God and God is not giving an answer, and because of that they say, I will no longer pray, it's useless to pray. Relativism, these people, it's in fact, there is no clear pronunciation for positive or negative feelings. And this is of course related to the fact that they don't commit themselves. There is no personal commitment, no personal involvement, and because of that, there is no affective structure. We see clearly that second naivete believers have a high level of positive feelings. So people are happy with that. Okay. Now I show you the last slide. That's only as an element. Yeah. So we have formulated in different stages. It's not in first step. It takes different steps. We have. Is better, sir? Yeah. Okay. We have formulated statements trying to measure the different attitudes, the orthodox attitude, external critique, relativism, and second naivete. And I show you now a little slide in order to show you, so every index, it's the position of a statement in his quadrant at first, and secondly, related to the 2 axes. So you can see very clearly that some statements here, for example, is very literal and rather low in belief. But another statement, here for example, is in fact very high in literal and also very high in belief. So each statement is always a combination between the acts of literal and symbolic thinking and the acts of belief and unbelief. And so you can give an idea how these different statements are organizing around these 2 axes. Important for me, and that's a little bit as a researcher, is the fact that we have now, I think, 11 or 12 translations in different European countries. So we have Dutch and English and French and Spanish and German and I think Slovenia, Hungary, Estonia, Swedish, Polish also,
Lithuania.
And Lithuania also. And every time again we see very clearly that the basic structure of these elements are stable. So we can organize around the 2 axes, the items are organized in a rather similar way. There are of course some differences, that's clear. But generally spoken you can say that the statements are organized in a similar way. And that I think it's important. Okay. We see also secondly, there are some similarities between the fields and some differences. So it's clear that these 2 fields are rather opposite. So if you are an Orthodox believer, left up, you are certainly not a relativist believer or unbeliever. That's clear. Also, these 2 are very opposite. So, if you are external critique, you are certainly not second naivete. So, the 2 fields, because 2 axes are different. Orthodox is literal and believer. Relativism is symbolic and unbeliever. External critique is literal and unbeliever. And second naivete is symbolic and believer. So, the 2 elements are opposing with each other. Secondly, we see clearly that there are some similarities between here and here and here and here. For example, orthodoxy, there are some similarities, formal similarities with external critique. Both are literal believers. There are some similarities between second naivete and relativism. Both are symbolic thinkers. And at the same time, of course, there are some similarities between Orthodox and second naivete. Both are believers. And some similarities between relativism and external critique. Both are unbelievers. So in that sense, you can analyze the data, and that's perhaps interesting into future projects. You could analyze the data always from two perspectives. At first, the perspective is looking to the different fields, the four quadrants: orthodoxy, second naivete, relativism, and external critique. Or you can analyze the data following the axis of belief, unbelief, and literal and symbolic thinking. Every time again, of course, you are mixing some elements, but every time, every statement is always a mixture, like I said, from the element of belief and the element of thinking. I think interesting in that model is the fact that we have now not only models or elements to measure religiosity, or what you could call belief systems, faith systems, but that there is also a specific position for unbelievers. And that was not the case later in the Glock-and-Stark model, later in the Alport model. There it was only lower scores. But here we have a rather clear position of belief and unbelief, and also literal and symbolic thinking, and that's important. Certainly in so-called secularized countries. And I think the Flanders is a rather secularized country at the moment. When I made my PhD, it's some years ago, in '76, we could use, on that moment, let's say, very religious colored statements. My experience is that on the moment, it becomes very difficult to use the same statements on the moment, because many of the statements are no longer useful, or perhaps no longer understandable by a majority of our people on the moment. Okay. So, last element I want to notice is the fact, I think, and we have done some studies, I cannot explain that now, that in fact there are two ways of interacting basically with belief or unbelief, but certainly with belief. I will say some words about that. And I focus now more on orthodoxy at the first, and then later on second naivete. Orthodoxy is, I think, a kind of anxiety and uncertainty reduction process. So people are trying to reduce anxiety, to reduce uncertainty by believing. And that believing, but that's for later on, is not only in the religious way, orthodoxy, but perhaps also in the non-religious way, external critique. So some people have problems in their life, you can say, problems of underlying anxiety and underlying uncertainty. And they are trying to reduce that anxiety and that uncertainty, or in a religious way, or in external critique, a non-religious way. And we have an experience of some studies that this is fundamentally related to what we call the process of basic trust. And that's remarkable, because that process of basic trust is in fact a process in the first year of life, in the baby time. On that moment, one of the targets, you can say, of development is to attain what Erikson is calling, Erik Erikson, famous psychologist, the basic trust. Basic trust, that means, very concretely for a baby, I'm hungry and my mother is coming to feed me. Or I'm anxious and someone is coming to support me. That in fact gives the effect in the baby's life, on a rather unconscious level on that moment, of course, that in fact the world is good. The world is reliable at first, and I am accepted by that world. Now it seems that some people have problems with that basic trust. And we have some studies showing that they are trying, let's say, to reduce that anxiety, to reduce that ambivalence by giving or by interacting on a rather specific way with religion, or in a general word, with ideology. That can be a religious ideology, a faith or belief structure, or perhaps also an unbelieving ideology, a kind of external critique ideology. That's one way of interacting with religion. A certain way of interaction, the second way, of interacting with religion is the fact that people are using, and using is perhaps a little dangerous word, it's a little bit too practical, but I don't find another on the moment, are using the religious tradition as a kind of horizon of meaning. So there are some stories, there is some religious tradition, there is some interpretation, and people recognize some elements in that religious tradition and can link these elements with their personal life. And I give another example. For example, you know, of course, the story of the desert. It's a very important element in the Old Testament, Moses walking in the desert. Of course, most of the people, perhaps you in Australia, you have some experience of deserts. We don't have in Belgium. It's too small for that. And in fact, people have the experience of the desert. It's not only that sandy desert, but it's in fact an affective feeling. What do I feel? Which are my connotations when I use the concept of a desert or when I hear the story of a desert? So people can recognize that. There are some similarities between what they have experienced in their own life, they have difficult problems, and the story of, let's say, in the Bible. So they can link the two together. As, like I said, they use the stories of the Bible, they use the religious tradition as a kind of horizon of meaning. Now, the second element, basically, the difference between the two is what I called in the beginning the concept of ambiguity. In fact, Orthodox people have problems in living with ambiguity. They want to have a clear-cut answer. Most of them also are borrowing their answers to religious authorities. When my priest is saying something, it's true. When my bishop is saying something, it's more true. And when the Pope is saying something, it's absolutely true. So in fact, they can't live with ambivalences, with ambiguities. They want to have a clear answer. And certainly you have experience in your work that some people are asking from people of catechesis or theologians, give me an answer. Not a very long one, a short one. Perhaps they like to have an answer, yes and no. And you know, of course, that's very difficult more and more to give answers in terms of yes and no on very important religious questions. That's less the case with people in the second naivete tradition, like I call it. These people are aware of the fact that you can't give a clear-cut yes and no answer. They are aware of the fact that every answer can be changed later on. There's a kind of evolution in the answer structure, and that's important. So, two ways of interacting with religious tradition. Religious tradition formulated in Bible stories, formulated in other things. Two ways, namely, in fact, reducing of anxiety at first, and secondly, in fact, trying to live with an horizon of meaning. On the moment, I will give the chair to Lieven Boeven. Perhaps if you have now direct questions. Oei.
You silenced us all, I think.
Hello. Pauline, do you hear me?
Yes, we can, Didier.
Okay. Perhaps you can invite people of the group to ask first questions of clarification.
Yes, Annette.
Just that last point you made, religion as evolution. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
As evolution, I mean that all we are aware, if you think of your own life story, that in fact there is a kind of evolution in the understanding of the stories. I think we understand the story differently when we are 7 or 8 and 12 and 13 and perhaps later on. So that I mean by evolution. So there is no one absolutely fixed meaning. In our personal tradition, in our personal life, there will be some kind of change. I remember me, for example, in my own life, I remember me very well, my professor of religion, I think when I was 12 or 13, I think 12, was telling the story of the Ark of Noah. You say Ark of Noah? With the animals?
Yes.
Okay. No, you understand it. No, it was...
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, I remember very well, as a child, we understand that. It's a very funny story. All these animals going together in that Ark of Noah, good organized, good disciplined, not killing themselves, and the other one, etc. Perhaps you have another story of Noah. No. I remember very well when my professor of religion, I think I was 12, 13, was telling that in fact that was not a real historical story. I was terribly frustrated on that moment as a child, because on that moment it was a real story, good fitting with my ideas as a child on that moment. It was fitting with your personal development, you can say. But later on, you're aware that in fact this is a story, and you have not to understand it literally. I give a story, and that's a real story, of our first rector of this university, Professor Pieter Zomer. He was a medical doctor, and we could say, and I can say that a rather positive man, positivist perhaps. So when he has little children, he was not telling the story of St. Nicholas to his children, because he said you cannot tell this kind of stories. We say from the beginning that the parents are giving presents at December 6th. important and remarkable is his children didn't believe him. Because on that moment, that is fitting with your self-image, is fitting with your ideas, is fitting with your understanding of the world. And I think the same thing is more or less going on when we are speaking about religious stories. They are different now when you're 40, in my case 60, a little bit more, and if you're 7 or 8. And that I think we have to be aware of the fact and accept, you can say, that these stories are changing. I give always the example, and my two colleagues of theology will approve. Suppose that there is only one interpretation. I think that the library of theology in Leuven, perhaps the biggest one in the world if I'm right, would be much smaller if you have only one interpretation. Every time again, every year, every month, books are coming with new interpretations. Interpretations colored by evolution of culture. Interpretations coming by evolution of persons. That I mean by this kind of interpretation. But it's important as a believer that people can live with this kind of changing, also with this kind of ambivalence, with this kind of ambiguity. It's never absolutely clear. Perhaps if it's absolutely clear, it becomes a little bit dangerous.
I'd be really interested in hearing about the research that you've done on the belief scales and the types of results that you're finding in Europe at the moment.
Resultaten in Europa van uw onderzoek met de schaal.
Oh, no. I think you ask a question I can't give on this moment a clear answer. So perhaps your question is, if I understand your question rather good, how many people can we see in the different quadrants? Is that your question? How is the population in Europe distributed over the questions? Is that a little bit your question?
I'm more interested in the trends, where you're finding the trends.
Oh yeah, that I can say something. For example, if I'm looking to the different samples, and we have many thousand subjects in the Flanders, you can say more or less, but be careful, don't fix me on that number, please, that more or less 20%, 15 to 20% of the population in the Flanders are situated in the Orthodox field. And most of these people are a little bit older than the mean. So if people are 65 and more, there is a higher tendency that they are Orthodox. But I think that the meaning of orthodoxy is a little bit different if you are 65 and more and if you are, for example, 20. And the reason is fundamental that people of 65 and more are educated in a totally different system than people are educated now. In fact, these people are educated, the religion, the faith tradition was a kind of a black box, and you had to take the black box as a wall. Don't ask questions, see? But if you are now, I think now on the moment, if younger people, and we have younger people, from 15 to 25, who are more or less orthodox, I think this is much more related to a kind of what I could call personality structure than, for example, people 65 and more. So more or less 15 to 20%. If I'm looking now to younger people, let's say between 15 and 30, more or less 15, 25, 30, most of them, the majority, can be situated, certainly if you take large examples, in what we call relativism. The group of external critique is in fact also something 15 to 20%. But most of the adults, more or less still committed to the church, committed to religion, more and more are situated in the field of second naivete. That's clear. So people now still engaged in the church, working, engaging themselves, participating, have a tendency to be situated in that field of interpretative religiosity. And we see differences with other countries. For example, the situation in Poland is rather different. You have to know that in Belgium, in Europe, that in fact we had, until 20, 30 years ago, 3 very Catholic countries. The Flanders in Belgium, Ireland, and Poland. And I have the impression, but that I'm a little bit careful because we have only 2 samples, that the structure of the data is a little bit different, no, not a little bit, is different if you compare Flemish data, let's say, and Polish data. I have the impression but I'm careful because we have small samples, so you have to be a little bit careful. That in Poland, let's say, if people are religious, of course they are Catholic most of the time, and they are Orthodox. And the three other positions, external critique, relativism, and second naivete, are in fact critical oppositions, you can say more or less, with the Orthodox position. Critical from the outside, external critique, relativism; critical from the inside, second naivete. But I'm a little bit careful because I know that the samples are rather small, and at that moment I'm a little bit careful. But I think there are some differences. But to give an idea, perhaps Didier Pollefet was telling that when he was in Melbourne, that we have in the Flanders certainly a terrible change, and nobody has predicted that change 50 years ago. For example, to give you one number, I didn't mention numbers, in '64, I think on that moment 65% of the population of Flanders was going to Mass every Sunday. So that was the absolute majority. On this moment, there's an estimation of 8 to 9%. So we have a terrible change in the last 40 years, and I think on this moment nobody knows exactly which are the reasons for that change. We can give it, let's say, description after the effects, but it's very difficult, and I think on the moment we don't have real clear theoretical construct why this change was going on. But I can say if people on the moment in the Flanders, certainly adults, are still committed with religion, most of them are committed on a rather second naivete style.
Hello?
Just a comment.
Can I just ask one more question from here on? So it's true, I think, that for people within the church, and also I think like principals of schools, that they find themselves in the second naivete. But I think what we have found out already in our preliminary research in Australia is that also young people there tend to move more to relativism on the one hand, and that church authority on the other hand is moving or is in orthodoxy. So I'm very careful in what I'm saying, but I think that's the case. Now my question is, how can you work with these people to build up, because that's their question, how you can work with people in second naivety but also with relativists and people in orthodoxy to build up a community, a Catholic community, would be my question.
The basic problem is, of course, that orthodoxy and relativism are two very opposed stands. They are opposed in the field. The one is left up and the other is right under. And in fact, these two are fundamentally opposed. No, and there's a kind of discussion. I think if you see on the moment that younger people have a tendency to be relativist, I think, but that's my interpretation, that it can be a transitional period. They are in fact learning, and they have to be trained that in fact, if we are confronted with a religious element, that need a kind of interpretation. And of course, I can understand that the church is a little bit, let's say, directing himself or herself to a more orthodox viewpoint, because that gives, and I think personally, an illusion of absolute certainty. I think that doesn't work. I'm sure. It gives an illusion that everything is clear, but people don't like or have problems with this kind of clear answers. Okay.
But what if relativism will be seen not as a transitional period, but as a pattern that will also come into the mind of the next generation of adults? What should we do then?
Oh. I would be a little bit more positive than you, I think. It's perhaps interesting and positive that people are interested in religion. So that's not disappearing in their culture. So in that sense, I'm perhaps a little bit less pessimistic than you are, or give the impression to be.
I'm not pessimistic. My question would be, can you educate people from relativism towards second naivete?
Oh yes,
it's more. I think it's more easy to educate people from orthodoxy to second naivete than from relativism to second naivete, because the one is from literal to symbolic, but the other is from an unbelieving to a believing position.
Yeah. Sure. I think it's possible in that sense that if people are confronted with people making clear how they are committing themselves, then that's a kind of example. You cannot urge that. You cannot give a real training program and at the end you will have 95% of success. But you can give, people can be confronted with persons who are committing themselves. And then they see what's the value, the validity of that kind of commitment. And that's a kind of invitation. I don't think you can urge them to do that.
Okay, I would say that the project we have in Melbourne has as a goal that optimistic effort to bring people to that second IVT. Other questions from the other side of the world?
I just had one that I was wondering if we could actually create a hypothesis that if we educate our young people in our Catholic schools in a context that recognises the horizonless postmodern world, but engages them in a true debate about faith and belief, that if our hypothesis would be that we would be able to then enhance the numbers of young people who would be engaged in post-critical or second naivety.
Is this a remark or is it a question?
Yeah.
It's a question about whether there is a hypothesis you'd put from your typology that if we combine postmodernism with an exploration of faith in that formative years of a young person before they reach adulthood, that we'll actually see a growth in the post-critical or the second naivety.
Okay. Could I try to reformulate your question, saying that the postmodern environment can be understood as an invitation to come to second naivete? Is that your reflection?
Yeah, that's my hypothesis.
Can you reflect on that?
Sure. Sure, of course, because that's the world we are living in. We cannot construct another world. And in fact, they will be invited more and more to reflect on the different meanings. That's absolutely clear. My point is, we had to offer them interpretations, different interpretations, possible interpretations. And then, of course, we invite them to search their own interpretation, to see how that can be meaningful for them. And that's, I think, typical in this world, in this postmodern world. There is no longer one concrete answer for every specific question.
Okay, but the church is saying that we are stimulating relativism through that.
Yeah, but perhaps better stimulating relativism than a fundamentalism.
Okay, that's a clear statement.
Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hutsebaut.
Thank you.